Hi, I'm Darryl Mark, professor of economics here at South Dakota State University and market analyst on igrow.org. One of the things that I want to spend a little time talking about in this podcast is the ethanol coproduct market, in particular distillers grain market. It's really an interesting market, I think, to follow because it's a little bit newer than a lot of the traditional markets we follow in agriculture, and it's influenced by a number of factors, both on the grain production side, the fuel side, as well as the livestock side and the export side. So let's just dive in and talk a little bit about what this ethanol coproduct market is. And before doing that, I want to define a couple of the things that I might be talking about here just a little bit. One of them is a type of ethanol coproducts. Now, you have two different types of ethanol plants in the Midwest. Most of them tend to be dry mill ethanol plants. Dry mill ethanol plants are the ones that produce distillers grains, oftentimes dry distillers grains plus solubles, wet distillers grains plus solubles, or modified wet distillers grains plus solubles. The reason they're different, they're essentially the same product from a nutritional standpoint. They have about 32% crude protein, 12% fat. What's different in them is their water content. Dry distillers grain tends to have about 90% dry matter. Wet distillers grain tends to be about 35% dry matter. Modified wet tends to be right around 48 to 50% dry matter basis. So that's important when you start thinking about pricing issues. That's why I bring it up. But again, dry mill ethanol plants produce distillers grains. Wet mill ethanol plants produce gluten feed, corn gluten feed, which is about 18% crude protein and 2.5% fat on average. You typically can find both wet corn gluten feed and dry corn gluten feed, again, just different mostly on their moisture content then too. Now, I kind of tried to lump everything into those two categories, but certainly there's a lot of different branded products out there. A lot of ethanol plants are changing their co-products that they're marketing as feed because they're combining them together and branding their products a little bit differently. In some cases, gluten feed is being mixed with distillers grains, or other combinations are being made, or other extractions of oil or whatnot are taken out of the co-product. Very, very important from both a nutritional standpoint and especially an economic standpoint to know exactly what you're buying. So we're talking about some market averages here, obviously, in this podcast, though. The other thing I would point out that product can vary fairly significantly even within a plant. So even if you buy at the same plant or the same couple of plants, the dry matter content can vary over time, as well as maybe some of the other nutritional things. So you do want to be aware of that as well. Like I mentioned, the dry matter basis, or in other words, the amount of moisture in the product, is very important from a pricing perspective. Think about this. If you have a price that's quoted at $90 per ton on an as-is basis, if you convert that to a dry matter basis and are talking about dry distillers grain, the price is $100 per ton on a dry matter basis. In other words, that $90 per ton divided by the percentage dry matter of the product, which is 90%, so 90 divided by 90%, it's going to look at $100 per ton. If you're looking at modified wet distillers grain, your price is actually $187.50 a ton on a dry matter basis, again dividing by about 48% at that $90 per ton as-is price. Wet distillers grain, a $90 per ton as-is price, is going to be equivalent to about $258 on a dry matter basis. The reason I convert everything to a dry matter basis is when you talk to your nutritionist or the animal scientist here at South Dakota State, they're going to tell you that the dry matter content is what's important for livestock nutritionally. Really doesn't matter how much water is in there. Now, from a practical standpoint of how many trips you're making to the feed bunk with the feed wagon and how product is mixing together, sure, water is important, but in terms of pricing product and getting your money's worth, you want to know whether you're buying something on a as-is basis or on a dry matter basis. Looking at it on the other side there, $90 per ton dry matter price converts to about $81 per ton on an as-fed basis if you're talking about dry distillers grain, 90% dry matter content, so $90 times 0.9, or a modified wet distillers grain is going to be about $43 per ton on an as-fed basis if you're talking a $90 per ton dry matter price, or wet distillers grain is going to be about $31 per ton if the dry matter price is quoted to you at $90 per ton. So always, always, always know whether you're pricing your product in as-is or dry matter terms. And if you're looking at as-is, know exactly what the dry matter content of your product is. The reason for doing that is it can help you make decisions on whether the dry distiller's grain plus soluble is a better buy than wet distiller's grain plus solubles or modified wet distiller's grain. Helps you determine which is the cheapest, which is the most expensive. And I'm going to just show you graphically a little bit of that. All of these products, and including corn gluten feed on the last column there, are getting to be fairly extensively used in the livestock industry. This is actually data from USDA going back to 2007, showing the number of operations using ethanol co-products as well as their inclusion levels. Now, I know from anecdotal information and talking with cattle producers around the Midwest that the percentage operations using these co-products is much higher than what this data that's 5-6 years old would say, as well as inclusion levels. What's interesting to note is that every time corn prices tend to go up quite dramatically, the inclusion levels in most livestock rations tend to go up as well. Common inclusion levels probably around South Dakota might be anywhere from 10 up to 30 or maybe even 35% dry distiller's grain or wet distiller's grain, and that inclusion level that I mentioned is measured on a dry matter basis. But sometimes when corn prices spike dramatically, some producers have found ways to increase the inclusion level in their rations up closer to that 40 and 50% category. Now, I'm not a nutritionist, and I very much encourage you to talk to your nutritionists and your consultants to determine if that's appropriate for your operation. But from a marketing standpoint, those things do occur, and it's interesting to follow some of those trends. One of the other things that we know is that inclusion levels in the rations tend to be higher the closer you are to an ethanol plant, especially for wet distiller's grains, but it's even true for dry distiller's grains as well because there's water content in any of it. The feed yards, for example, that are closest to ethanol plants tend to have a transportation advantage and can originate product into their feed yards cheaper, and as a result tend to put more of it in their rations than ones farther away. In fact, that's what this graph is showing from some work we did at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln a few years ago, showing that inverse relationship between distance from an ethanol plant and the inclusion in feed yard rations. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that cattle performance does vary amongst even different types of distiller's grains, whether you're talking about wet, dry, or modified wet distiller's grain. This is again based on some research in animal science at the University of Nebraska, but the average daily gain in feed efficiency both tend to be different at different inclusion levels for different types of distiller's grains, even though the only real difference is the moisture content in those products. And that actually changes a lot of things from a marketing standpoint as well. Wet distiller's grains often tend to provide the best cattle performance, and there's the added advantage for an ethanol plant of not having to spend energy to dry the product down. However, it's not as shippable, it's not as exportable, it's not as easy to move wet product as it is dry product. So there's some pluses and minuses, and I'll show you some tools at the end of this podcast that can maybe help you weigh some of those pluses and minuses for your operation. This is a little bit of old data, but it's kind of interesting to take note of. Back in 2007, Agricultural Marketing Service, which is an agency of USDA, started reporting daily prices for ethanol co-products being sold in South Dakota ethanol plants, as well as those in surrounding states of Iowa and Missouri and Nebraska and Kansas. What's been interesting to note here in this particular graph, I'm going to show you a different graph that's similar in a second, but the average prices and the range of prices are denoted on this particular graph. We also conducted some research at UNL a few years ago, comparing what producers actually paid for their co-products compared to these average prices, and you see that on this next slide here. And what it shows is that the range of prices is much larger than what's reported. What's reported on a daily basis is very good information, but it tends to be spot market averages. In many cases, some producers are contracting and buying at much cheaper prices, and sometimes they're buying at much more expensive prices too, just depending on a variety of market conditions, quantity purchases, and a variety of things. So there's a lot of range around any of the prices that I'm going to show you in this presentation and what's available out there in the market. So you definitely want to have an opportunity to shop around on various types of products. Now on this graph, I'm showing you the daily corn price along with the dried distiller's grain, wet distiller's grain, and modified wet distiller's grain prices going back to 2007. and I'm showing it to you on an as-is basis, okay? So just with the moisture in there. The blue line there is a corn price, and so you're reading that over there on the right-hand axis, but all the others are as-is prices for dry distillers grain, wet and modified wet, red on the left axis. Note here that the red line is much higher than the green line, and that both are higher than the purple line. In other words, the drier the product, the higher the as-is price of the ethanol co-product is. Note also that they tend to follow the corn market fairly closely. Now I'm going to show you what the difference between the ethanol co-product prices and corn prices are in just a minute, but before we do that, let's take a look at the dry, the wet, and the modified wet prices on a dry matter basis. So now on this graph, I basically took all the water out of each of those product prices, and so we're comparing things on a more apples to apples basis, so to speak, by taking the water out of them. Now look at dry distillers grain prices are still higher than the other two, but not nearly so much, because we basically are comparing on a dry matter basis. The reason dry distillers grain prices are still higher priced than modified wet or wet distillers grain prices is because there's more uses for dry distillers grain. There's a larger demand market out there. Dry distillers grain can be put on rail cars and shipped to California dairies or into Texas feed yards. It can also be put in containers and shipped on ocean-going vessels into the Asian markets. There's other demand uses for those products, whereas for modified wet and wet distillers grain, not quite so much the case. It also depends a little bit on what plants are producing and what the biggest demand is from livestock producers in terms of which has the highest price. But typically modified wet and wet tend to be fairly close in price. You notice on some of the last price points on my graph here that modified wet distillers grain was actually the cheapest in January and early February of 2012 relative to wet and dry distillers grain. All right, this next graph is really kind of a busy one, but really I think one of the most important ones too. What it does is compare the price of wet distillers grain, dry distillers grain, and modified wet distillers grain to the price of corn. But I've done this all on a dry matter basis. So all the corn prices, all the distillers grain prices are all on a dry matter price basis. And so now we're comparing them on a percentage basis relative to the price of corn. And so if you're at 100%, that basically means the co-product is the same price as corn on a dry matter per pound basis. When it's cheaper, it means or when it's less than 100%, it means the co-product is cheaper relative to corn. Oftentimes, dry distillers grain kind of trade in that about 85 to maybe 93% of the price of corn on a dry matter basis. On average, maybe the wet distillers grain might trade closer to 80 or 85%. You notice here at times that co-products tend to get as cheap as 60% of the price of corn, and sometimes they even get higher than the price of corn. There's a variety of things that influence that, including the export market when you're talking about dry distillers grain, but also very much influenced by big spikes in the corn market. When the corn market spikes dramatically, typically co-product prices don't go up quite as much, and as a result, co-products become much cheaper relative to the price of corn. And you can see that back there in about August 2011 where you saw a big dip in these percentage relationships. We had the big rally in the corn market then. Co-product prices went up, but not as much. When this price ratio drops to its lower levels, that's when we typically see more inclusion in cattle feedlot rations and even in hog and poultry rations because it's a better buy relative to corn prices. So it's an important graph to watch right now. And similar to the last one, you can see here relative to the price of corn that in the last weeks of April and beginning of May, modified wet distillers grain was actually the cheapest relative to the price of corn. This next graph shows the seasonal trend or the seasonal average price for dry distillers grain. That's on the blue line here. What I've overlaid on the graph along with the seasonal price trend for dry distillers grain are cattle on feed numbers in the United States. And one of the things you note here is that there's a reasonably good correlation between the two. The reason being is that the cattle industry tends to be one of the largest uses for ethanol co-products, including dry distillers grain. So when we have a lot of cattle on feed or we're supplementing cow-calf operations, supplementing their beef cow herds in the winter months with ethanol co-products, demand tends to be higher and as a result, we tend to see prices bid up beyond their seasonal average. Seasonal lows typically tend to happen in June, July, and August when we're not supplementing cow herds and when cattle on feed inventories tend to be the lowest. Okay, so that's a seasonal trend in dried distiller's grain. It's fairly true in wet and modified wet product as well. One of the reasons I point this out is it's become more and more common in those summer months where there's maybe a good opportunity to find a buy or a good value on distiller's grain products, to buy some of those products and stockpile them. Now, you need to look into the research on the efficacy of doing that in your operation. Dry distiller's grain, not terribly difficult to store. When you're dealing with a wet product like wet distiller's grain or modified wet distiller's grain, there's some additional steps that are going to have to be taken to store long-term a very, very wet product. But there are ways to do that, and that information is out there, and I'll point you to some of that here on the last slides in this podcast. In terms of alternatives for risk management in the co-product market, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. From a derivative standpoint, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange offered a distiller's grain contract a couple of years ago. It really was never a successful contract, never very liquid at all, so that's really not a great alternative for most producers. However, there is an opportunity to cross-hedge into the corn and soybean meal markets, into those futures contracts. Those cross-hedge ratios do change over time and really are still evolving. So you might talk with your broker market advisors on whether or not that's a feasible alternative for you. Probably some of the cash contracting opportunities are maybe some of the best, as well as even using storage is a way to manage risk of increasing prices in the co-product market. Historically, some of these contracts aren't always available. I think they're getting to be more steadily offered, though, in recent years. But it used to be that ethanol co-product, where prices were locked in for such a long period of time by the ethanol plant that they couldn't respond to changing margins very well in pricing their output. So that's changed a little bit, but cash contracting is still probably one of the best ways to go with respect to that. Now, I mentioned there are a number of economic issues associated with feeding ethanol co-products, especially to cattle, and I'm mostly concentrating on cattle in this podcast. As you saw in a couple of the slides that I was showing you, these distiller's grain products typically tend to be less expensive relative to the price of corn. And as I was stating earlier, typically cattle tend to do better on them from a performance standpoint when you're feeding somewhere around maybe 30-35% of the ration as co-product on a dry matter basis. So there's certainly a couple of positives there, but it's also true that depending on where you're located, feeding ethanol co-products may increase the transportation cost of originating the product to your operation. It might even increase the feeding and handling costs within your operation if you're feeding a very wet, heavy, bulky product. And it's possible that because the cattle performance is increased, it might reduce your days on feed, which might lower your yardage and interest costs if you happen to be a commercial feeder feeding for other people. So there are some positives and some negatives, not necessarily an easy thing to weigh together because it's really not a linear relationship in some respects. One of the tools that's available out there is a spreadsheet tool called Cattle Code, which stands for Co-Product Optimizer Decision Evaluator. Essentially what it is a cattle feeding budget that incorporates some of these issues with ethanol co-products in there, like I've been talking about, along with other prices that you define specific to your operation. If you're interested, you can pick up a copy of that spreadsheet free of charge at beef.unl.edu. Another spreadsheet that's available to help you make decisions relative to storing co-products and taking advantage of that seasonal marketing trend there, the cheapest prices in the summertime, is a spreadsheet called Store, again available on the beef website at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, beef.unl.edu, to try to look at whether or not it's physically and economically feasible to purchase co-products and spend some money by ensiling them or bagging them to feed at a later date. So because every situation there again is different, it's very important to go back and really evaluate that. That spreadsheet will do a good job in helping you sort through those decisions there as well. Again, available at beef.unl.edu. There's there's a variety of resources available on the ethanol co-product market, in particular related to pricing of these co-products. I'd invite you to view some of them at the Livestock Marketing Information Center, which South Dakota State's a member of. There's a number of good ethanol co-product fact sheets there as well, as some information available at Iowa State University on Matrix, as well as UNL's beef website there as well. Of course, South Dakota State has a number of good information resources on ethanol co-product feeding as well, in both the cattle and the hog side. Certainly want to encourage you to view those resources on igrow.org as well. And so with that, I'm again Darryl Mark for iGrow, and appreciate you joining me to learn a little bit more about the ethanol co-product market.